All right, we're back. So we had technical difficulties uh, because I don't know, some computer malfunction. So the thing stopped after about 6 minutes. I don't know. I guess it was going on for about 20 minutes, but a lot of those minutes were I was waiting to the streaming went off or whatever. I don't know. You never know with this thing. Okay, so I think I said at the beginning of the other one was, Pale Fire is a book written by Vladimir Nabokov. The standard reading of it is there's a foreword by Charles Kinbote, who you don't really know really that much about him at that time. And then there's a poem by John Shade, Pale Fire, 999 lines. And then there's a commentary by Charles Kinbote, who's his friend, who kind of just really talks about himself and the possibility that he's the king of Zembla. And he kind of takes you for, he kind of like is an unreliable narrator or something. So, and then there's an index, which tells you more and stuff. So there's some readings of it that this book is all in the mind of Shade. Like Shade wrote the poem, Shade invented Kinbote, and all these characters. And then there's other things that say that Shade is not real, that Kinbote invented Shade. And then I think there's a fourth reading where neither Shade or Kinbote exist, but the Bodkin is like the true author. I think so. I think that's where it goes. So let's talk about the book. Okay, so when you get to line 502, there's a pun on Grand Potato. On his deathbed, Rabelais was supposed to have said, "I go to seek the great," perhaps, in French, as Kinbote explains. Je m'en vais chercher le grand poète, or Grand Potato in Shade's terms. A spiritual man, Kinbote finds Shade's remarks on the afterlife in Canon 3 flippant. Kinbote recounts a discussion with Shade about spiritual and philosophical matters. He writes it in the form of a drama or a philosophical dialogue. Kinbote is a Christian and Shade is an atheist. Shade thinks that there might be a poetry without sin, but he does not believe in original sin. Without God, Kinbote says, then poor Kinbote's ghost and poor Shade's Shade would wander through eternity with no support, no protection, nothing. Kinbote shifts the focus to an earlier part of the poem. In his note to line 12, he's discussed two lines. He said, came from the draft. I must forget to say something that my old friend told me of a certain king. Now, Kinbote admits, or half admits, he made up those lines. He tarried in his distress and disappointment on the brink of falsification. He asks readers to ignore these two lines, but he says he doesn't have time to change the comment. In the comment about line 579, the other Kinbote discusses the foibles of college English departments. He says the wordsmith United English Department is soaked in literary talent, Freudian fantasies, and ignoble heterosexual lust. He says he won't go through the tedium of recounting the rumors that Shade's mistress, but then he does so, switching to one of his favorite topics, his friendship with Shade. Then he recalls the 3 times he dined at the Shades, the 3rd time he dropped in uninvited. Kinbote reproduces some lines from a draft, or perish must alike great temples and Tanagra dust. Tanagra is a town in Greece. He points out that the final words contain the name of a murderer, Gratus, in the last letters of Tanagra and the first letters of dust. As proof this code is intentional, he offers the fact very few such combinations are possible and plausible. That is, there are very few words in English ending with -rad that could be combined with another word beginning with us. He says only a scrupulous regard for the truth kept them from inserting these lines of the draft into the finishing poem. Kinbote narrates Greatest times in Geneva while he waits to take his next steps. Greatest sinks into idleness. a paradoxically common state for men of action. He reads the multilingual literature that comes with nose drops and digestive tablets. This is the extent of greatest intellectual curiosity, according to Kinbote. Kinbote then considers what might have happened if King Charles had been caught between the palace and Rippleson caves. He thinks Charles would have behaved as he does in lines 606, 608. Thus, Kinbote speaks as if the executed man imagined in the poem were King Charles of Zembla. Kinbote then turns to a line of shade that refers to a poem by the 18th century writer Goethe, the Earl King. He examines the metric form of Goethe's poem. He shows how the quoted lines rhyme in Zemblan, though they do not rhyme in English. He says another fabulous ruler, the last king of Zembla, recited these lines to himself in English and German as he climbed the mountains to escape. He then comments unfavorably on using titles based on a phrase lifted from more or less celebrated poetical work for the past. He comments on Sybil's French translations and the practice of giving hurricanes feminine names, like Lolita. In the philosophical dialogue, readers get a glimpse into Kinbote's inner world. When he remarks on what God is not, he unwittingly gives a catalog of torments he himself has suffered. According to Kinbote, God is not despair, he's not terror. God is also not the mortality Kinbote fears. He is not the black hum in one ear's fading to nothing, in nothing. Kinbote admits something in this part of the commentary. He states it in a convoluted way. Um, in fact, he never went over the brink of inventing some lines of the draft. And apparently, John Shade never wrote the lines, I must not forget to say something that my old friend told me of a certain king. This admission undoes Kinbote's commentary. If he falsified that part of the draft, what has he not falsified? The impression of the whole commentary is a series of fabrications is strengthened by Kinbote's remark on the poem "The Earl King" by Goethe. The title literally means the alder king, as in type of tree, alder, but it has been translated as the elf king. The poem is based on a legend of a wicked forest elf who preys on travelers stealing their children. In the poem, a father rides with a child through the forest at night, menaced by the Earl King. The first lines are, who's riding so late where the wild winds blow? It is the father grasping his child. John Shade's poem alludes to these lines with, who rides so late in the night and the wind? It is the rider's grief. But rather than comment on Shade's loss of his daughter Kinbote, but rather comment on the Shade's loss of his daughter Kinbote uses the Goethe reference to Seg, to another fabulous ruler, the last king of Zembla. This means that King Charles of Zembla is a fable, just like the Earl King. Another clue to Charles' fiction lies in the closeness of the Shade's poem and Charles' story. The Earl King is often alluded to in the Shade poem. Kinbote claims that King Charles recited its first two lines to himself over and over while he escaped over the mountain. This coincidence suggests one mind created Shade, Kinbote, and King Charles. Something similar happens with the convergences between Shade's poem and Kinbote's story. Kinbote again produces lines of the draft he claims that are genuine. Shade's alleged draft mentions the exile in a chance and exposed to the hot breath of this America. Kinbote finds here a reference to the place he inhabits now, the log cabin where he is trying to coordinate these notes. When Kinbote finds traces of Zembla in the poem, he has a story about how they got there. He told Shade his story, but it is not possible for Shade to have foreseen Kinbote's exile after his death. Kinbote's proof points to the possibility he wrote Shade's draft, if not the whole poem. So that's that part. So we get to line 681. And how are we doing for time? Okay, so we're in 9 minutes. Okay, Kinbote uses the coincidence of Shade's poem mentioning gloomy Russians to discuss the two Russian shadows. They are assigned to hunt for the Zemblan ground jewels. which Baron Bland, the keeper of the treasure, hid before he jumped or fell from the North Tower. The two begin excavating the castle. Kinbote suddenly addresses the two shadows, but you will never find our crown, necklace, and scepter. Thus, Kinbote uses the royal first person to refer to himself, admitting he is Charles. While the poem discusses Shade's heart attack, Kinbote continues with the Zemblin narrative in a discussion of the king. In the discussion of King Charles' arrival in America, Kinbote switches from third person to first person. Kinbote describes Charles in the third person, wrestling with unfamiliar French contraption, the parachute, which he lands at Sylvia O'Donnell's estate in Maryland. Then Kinbote uses the first person when speaking as the king. He remarks that while the chauffeur was folding up that same parachute, King Charles relaxed, sipping a delightful scotch and water. Kinbote then tells readers in the first person the story of learning he would soon be living next to his favorite American poet. Sylvia warns Kinbote he will have to be discreet about his sexuality in America. Your Majesty will have to be quite careful from now on. Kinbote returns briefly to the Shade poem. He says there was never anything organically wrong with Shade's heart, but this factual error does not detract from the great epic beauty of the passage. Greatest arrives on the French Riviera, but Disa has gone to Italy for the rest of July. Greatest finds himself without anything to do. Kinbote returns to the poem to admire its interplay of link words and contrapunctional pyrotechnics, as well as the puns on shade. Shade is the poet's name, and a nuance, as in a shade of meaning, and another word for ghost. Back on the Riviera, Greatest receives some information from an agent in a green velvet jacket. He gives Greatest a slip of paper where the king's American alias, the name of the university where he taught, and that of his the town. Greatest memorizes the information and eats the paper. Kinbote quotes from a letter to a friend, and he gives only his campus address and urges his friend to address mail to Dr. C. Kinbote, Kinbote, not Charles X. Kingbot. Kinbote recounts how he believed he heard Shade address him one day. Come tonight, Charlie, he heard Shade say, though Shade was not there. In response, Kinbote calls several times in a row. He says Shade eventually invited him to go for a good ramble tonight. He does not appear to see Shade was trying to get him to stop calling. Kinbote briefly alludes to the next walk after that one on July 21st, the day of Shade's death. That walk was exceedingly brief. Kinbote then considers wordplay that would have, sure, enraptured his poet. He also quotes from the book loaned to him by the motel owner in Cedarn, the letters of Franklin Lane. He finds the writing reminds him of Shade's poem. Kinbote recalls people in New why often saying he resembled King Charles of Zembla. Kinbote did his best to dismiss these remarks. All bearded Zemblins resemble one another. He notes Zembla is Semberland, a land of reflections, of resemblers. Since the king is missing, the faculty at New why don't know whether he is alive or dead. Shade says the king might be dead or may be much very alive. Kinbote quarrels with Gerald Emerald about the king. So Kinbote comments on the two Soviet professionals, noting their names are probably fictitious. The reader is aware that their names are definitely fictional, however. The words fictitious and fictional mean approximately the same thing. Something made up or invented. A work of literature is said to be fictional. Something fake, passed off in real life, is fictitious. Kinbote's commentary tries to separate the facts from the fictitious. In doing so, he calls attention to the fictional status of the entirety of Pale Fire. A man in a green velvet jacket gives Greatest the name Charles Kinbote, pseudonym of King Charles. The man is Zetamarov, an agent of the extremists. Zetamarov is similar to Gerald Emerald, the green jacket instructor at Wordsmith, who gives Greatest a ride to Gold's Worth house. The paucity of fictional material is only a few characters to go around suggests the same mind made up Emerald and Izamarov. Of course, Nabokov made them both up, but on another level, it appears possibly Kinbote or Bodkin is writing the story. Okay, so how are we doing on time? So 15 minutes in. Let's go to the last section here. Kinbote and Shade share a dislike in 19th century psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, whose ideas are very popular in the English department at Wordsmith. Kinbote also remarks on the direct mention of Zembla in the Shade poem. Old Zembla, its source is 18th century British writer Alexander Pope, an essay on man. The scant mention makes Kinbote a weary and sad commentator. He asks, so this is all the treacherous old Shade could say about Zembla, my Zembla. Greatest arrives in New York. Kinbote observes Greatest has no capacity to enjoy new things. The next day, Greatest eats a lot and then takes a plane to New Y. Feeling ill from something he ate, Greatest asks around campus for Kinbote, but Kinbote eludes him. Gerald Emerald gives Greatest a ride to Kinbote's house. Arriving at Kinbote's house, Greatest is distressed by food poisoning. Kinbote imagines he couldn't decide whether to discharge his gun or rid himself of inexhaustible lava in his bowels. Kinbote remarks on a line of the poem, "Help me, Will, pale fire." Shade prayed to Shakespeare for the title of his poem, but Kinbote is not sure which plays Pale Fire is from. In Siddharn, where he writes the commentary, he has only a tiny vest pocket edition of Time in Athens and Zamblin. Kinbote comments on line 1000, which is not in the Shade poem as printed in Pale Fire. Kinbote says the missing line is the same as the first. I was the shadow of the waxwing slain. Thus, it rhymes with Lane in line 999. Shade tells Kinbote he has nearly finished the poem. Kinbote invites him to come over to his place and celebrate with half a gallon of Tokay, a knackle of walnuts, a couple of large tomatoes, and a bunch of bananas. Shade holds the poem written on index cards in a large envelope as they walk to his house. Kinbote says Kinbote. Kinbote holds the envelope. He believed at this point Shade's poem was about Zembla. I was holding all Zembla pressed to my heart. As they walk in this lane between their houses, Shade said, "You have a caller." Greatest stands on Kinbote's porch. Kinbote mutters, "I will kill him." He does not want the rapture of the poem delayed. Greatest fires several bullets. He misses Kinbote, but hits Shade, killing him. Kinbote's gardener then hits Greatest on the head with a shovel, knocking him out. The gardener attends to the killer while they wait for the police. The killer gives his name as Jack Gray, an escapee from an institute from the criminally insane. That night, Kinbote reads the poem. He admits he had stupidly believed that Shade was composing a poem about the king of Zembla, but there is nothing of that kind in the poem. He is crushed. Oh, but I cannot express the agony. Later, he calms down and rereads the poem. This time, he finds echoes and spangles of his mind, a long ripple wake of his glory in the poem. Sybil expresses a deep gratitude for Kinbote for having thrown himself between the gunman and his target. In gratitude, she strokes his hand and says, "No recompense could repay him for his heroism." Kinbote asks for permission to edit Shade's last poem, and she agrees. They sign a contract. Kinbote has several interviews with Jack Gray. Later, he learns Gray killed himself. Exit Jack Gray. Kinbote spends another week in New Y, not knowing where to keep the poem safe. He sews it in its index cards into his suit. He walks around New Y, plated with poetry, armored with rhymes, bulletproof at long last. Returning to the present, Kinbote says it's time to wrap up his commentary. My work is finished. My poet is dead. However, he says, not everything is over. He might turn up on another college campus. He is sure another assassin is coming for him, a bigger, more respectable, more competent Greatest. This part of the commentary tells of the death of Shade and Kinbote's first encounter with the poem. Kinbote's first reading of the poem is a deeper crisis for him than is the death of Shade, murdered before his eyes. Even while Shade lies on the ground, Kinbote dashes into Goldsworth's house to find a hiding place for the poem. Later that night, he is crushed to find no mention of Zembla. Where was Zembla the Fair and the whole marvelous tale? But he then redoubles his effort to find correspondence to Zembla in the poem. Thus, he finds pale phosphorescent hints and many subliminal depths to him in Shade's words. Sybil, too, is indebted to Kinbote. Kinbote claims in a scene that seems invented to gratify Kinbote's ego, Sybil uncharacteristically strokes Kinbote's hands and cries out she can never pay him enough. Later, Kinbote decides to hide the poem in the lining of a suit, a symbol of over-identification with the work of Shade. He is plated with poetry as his body becomes indistinguishable from the manuscript. The scene brings a new meaning to Kinbote's saying in the foreword. It is the commentator who has the last word. Kinbote literally has possession of Shade's last words because he has stolen them. Then he moves from holding the words to secreting them upon his person. So he becomes Shade's last words. Kinbote claims greatest Greatest's pleasure in killing the king is very slight. Likewise, in the story of the pursuit of Charles and knew why, Nabokov gives Greatest a physical ailment to contend with. Diarrhea, heaping physical suffering on a character is a standard narrative technique. Here, the urge to kill the king is likened to a distasteful bodily function when Greatest cannot decide which he wants to do more, discharge a gun or rid himself in inexhaustible lava in his bowels. At the same time, Greatest is associated with the embodiment. Kinbote insists Greatest does not exist. On one level, Kinbote is saying Greatest is so morally undeveloped, he is not a person. Thus, Kinbote calls him this primate and says, spiritually, he does not exist. However, he also tars Charles with the same brush of non-existence. Morally, Greatest was a dummy pursuing another dummy. He could mean Greatest is pursuing the false Charles Kinbote. Pursuing the alien. He could mean Greatest is pursuing the alias Charles Kinbote. He could also mean that both Greatest and the King Charles are fictional characters. Morally, the assassination of the fictional king does not have the weight of a real murder. And yet, John Shade appears not to be a made-up character. Kinbote claims the dummy Greatest, his weapon is real, and his quarry is a highly developed human being. The fact that Shade's humanity belongs to our world of events also refers to Shade as the one who stumbles into the line of fire and perishes in the clash between the two figments. However, the fictional status of Greatest and Kinbote also entail Shade's fictional status. Okay, so we got through it. I hope. Okay, so that's only 23 minutes. Okay, so I'll stop this. And then we'll talk about the index in part 5.